Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it really means to lead in today's world. I'm Ed Schaefer, joined as always by my co-host Andy Siegmund. Here's a word I want you to sit with for a second. Stoic. What does that word call up for you? Maybe tough? Unfeeling? Doesn't complain? Gets it done? Jaw set, eyes forward, never lets you see the cracks? If that's your picture, you're not alone, and you're getting Stoicism wrong. Stoicism is one of the most misread philosophies in popular culture right now, and the misreading isn't harmless. There's a version of it floating around, call it Broicism, that has dressed up emotional avoidance, hustle obsession, and cold detachment as ancient wisdom. It has given leaders permission to be unreachable and unaccountable, and then call it a virtue. But it's not. It is the opposite of what the Stoics were actually about. The real philosophy, the one that came out of Athens and Rome, the one Marcus Aurelius was trying to practice while running an empire, is built on self-awareness, clarity about what you can and cannot affect, and a deep responsibility to the people around you. The Stoics cared about virtue. They cared about community. They cared about whether you were leaving things better than you found them. That does not sound like hustle culture. That sounds a lot like servant leadership. Today, Andy and I are reclaiming Stoicism. We'll walk through what Stoicism actually is, how the distortion happened, what it costs teams, what the 4 Stoic virtues actually demand of a leader, and what it looks like in practice to be genuinely Stoic, present with your emotions, not ruled by them, and deeply accountable to the people you serve. So Andy, before we get into any of that, when someone describes a leader as Stoic, do you hear that as a compliment or a warning sign?
Unfortunately, I think in today's usage of the word, it should be more often than not seen as a warning sign. This is one of those words that I like the differentiation of lowercase stoicism, which is the philosophy, which I think we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about today, and how to actually enact that, and then the capital S stoicism, which is kind of an anti-pattern, right? This more kind of broy corruption of it, right? It's not too dissimilar from like the small d democratic and big D democratic, right? One is the idea, the other is the current party, if you will. And I think it's really unfortunate that we've taken the word stoic and turned it into capital S stoic, right? Meaning unfeeling, unavailable, just kind of this like rock hard, like nothing phases me, super bullheaded kind of tough guy, or you see nothing from it, and that we've distanced it from the core of what it really should be, and the way that it can best help not just leaders, but I think everyone, right? Like the philosophy itself is not designed to make you a better psychopath, right? It's designed to make you a better citizen, and it's intended to make you a better citizen, and making you a better citizen makes you a better leader.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think the way everything you said tells us a lot about how the word lands today, and I totally agree with that. And I almost would think that I would almost say it's like stoicism, lowercase is the concept, and capital S stoicism is the philosophy, and then $ stoicism is the is like what it is today.
And that's fair. I just I find the binary is just much easier to explain and understand, right? With the lowercase being the ancient philosophy, tracing back to Rome, which, by the way, as 2 men sitting on a Zoom call talking about the Roman Empire, I think that this should be a meme somewhere. But and then capital S being kind of this unfortunate version of stoicism that is kind of reigning in popular culture and on social media and whatnot.
Yeah, well, let's talk about what stoicism actually is then. And I think for me, when I think of stoicism, the first thing that comes to mind is this flowchart that I saw probably 20 years ago now. It's a pretty simple flowchart. At the top, it says, do you have a problem? And it has yes or no. And if it's no, then it goes to why worry? Because if you don't have a problem, there's nothing to worry about. And then it says, if you have a problem, yes, then it says, well, can you do anything about it? And then if you choose yes, then it points to why worry? Because if you can do something about a problem, then there's nothing to worry about because you have some control over it. And then the other option is, can you do something about it? No. Well, then why worry? Because if you can't do anything about it, then there's nothing that can be done. So there's really nothing to worry about from it. And for me,
Mhm.
that I think is still, I know that's not all of Stoicism, it's just a part of it. But those four lines, I think, are a really clean and clear single page summary of Stoic thinking. That maps directly to Epictetus, who was one of three major Stoic writers. He was kind of one of the earlier ones. And his core argument is divide everything in life into what is up to us and what is not up to us. And the things that are up to us, those might include our judgments, our intention, our responses. And what's not up to us is basically everything else, right? Other people's choices, outcomes, circumstances. The Stoics would even say, like, you can control how you think about something or how you react to something, but you can't even control your own body, right? You might be able to
Mhm.
train and try to help physically bring yourself up, but if you get sick or you get cancer or something, like that's out of your control. There's really nothing that you can do about it. And so they say the things that are within your control you should act on, and the things that are not you should just release. And I think this kind of maps to the locus of control kind of concept. I think of it as like three categories, right? Where it's, well,
Mhm.
what's within my control, which is be the center. Then what can I influence? I might not be able to control it, but maybe I can have some influence on it. And that would be in that middle circle. And then everything else is out of my control, and you just need to accept it as it is. So it's kind of
Yeah,
that
and accept
question.
that all you can control is how you react to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm sure you're going to get into this too, Ed. Is like, um, what I think is one of the most compelling parts about Stoicism as a philosophy, and the history of it too, is Epictetus, literally a slave,
Yeah.
right? So Epictetus, and I'll let you talk about the other kind of cornerstones of Stoic philosophy here, right? But he is a slave who eventually became literate and eventually became freed, and his readings, like his writings, his Stoic thoughts, his version of philosophy was then read and enacted by kings, right? So I think that there's a really interesting through line of like, this is truly a an objective and like classless philosophy, right? Like it applies to everyone, people with the most power in the world, right? We're going to talk about Marcus Aurelius later, who was the most powerful man in the world at the time that he was alive. And he is a practitioner of the same philosophy that a slave is practicing, within a couple of generations there, which I think is really really interesting. And also like when we dive deeper into like the cardinal virtues and whatnot, you're going to notice there's a lot of crossover with most Western philosophy, a lot of Eastern philosophy, most religious texts kind of harp on the same sorts of things, which again I find to be really really interesting. And for those of you counting along at home, this is also functionally the core from which cognitive behavioral therapy comes out of, right? So a lot of the practice, if you're familiar with CBT, come out of Stoicism. Like you can trace those roots back to Stoicism.
Yeah, and it's in that case, it's almost directly like in the 1950s or whenever CBT was coming up. That if you look into where it originated and stuff, it almost points one to one directly back to the Stoic writing. Um,
Yeah, and to get kind of back to your flow chart, even another good way to think about it is, I think most folks, at least in Western countries, are familiar with the, either directly familiar or at least conceptually familiar with the serenity prayer, right? Yeah, the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference. That's basically Stoicism in a nutshell. Also, fun fact, it feels like the Serenity Prayer has probably been in existence since, I don't know, Ed, when do you think that was probably written?
oh, I mean, I think it's been probably co-opted multiple times. So I wouldn't be surprised if it dates back to Epictetus or in that
Yeah,
time period.
exactly. The version that we know, the version that's like recited at like AA meetings and whatnot, was literally written on a train in the 1930s. But it harps to what's been like literally ancient knowledge. So I'll end my total derailment of Ed's polished.
Oh no, that's great. And I
explanation.
think as you were talking about Epictetus and his background, which I didn't really put a bunch of notes together about that, because I feel like we could probably do multiple episodes if we wanted to deep dive in history and all of that. But I can't remember the name because I didn't write it down. But another one of the early Stoic thinkers, Stoic writers was, and if you remember the name as we're talking about this, throw it out there. But he was like a wealthy businessman, and basically all of his wealth was on these ships as he was transporting. He was like a merchant and was transporting all of these goods and everything. And the ship sunk, and he literally washed up on shore. I think it was like on shore on Athens. And
This was Zeno.
yeah, Zeno, that's who it was. So he literally like lost everything that he had, but was able to use Stoic kind of ideas and mindset and teachings to not let it destroy him. And he kind of came back and was able to rebuild in some ways because he didn't let the loss of everything destroy who he was as a person and like his outlook on things. I think that's another great example that's kind of similar to Epictetus's story. But so I guess looping back around to that flow chart and that idea of the locus of control and everything, Andy, I'm curious, when you're working with leaders who are under pressure, something's gone sideways or the stakes are like meaningful or impactful, do you feel like you see a lot of leaders actually sort through what's in their control versus what isn't? Or do you feel like you see most leaders kind of collapse into, I don't know, maybe panic or denial or some other emotions?
I think there's a lot of different reactions that you see. I think the most common is to focus on that locus of control, but at the detriment of delegation, right? So I see a lot of leaders, especially newer leaders, when things hit the fan, their default reaction is I'll do it myself, right? Which is focusing on locus of control, but it's taking control back rather than teaching and delegating and figuring out the best way to do it. I've seen more than a few who just spiral out of control, right? And what's interesting too is like with that kind of turn towards micromanagement, the core reaction is focusing on locus of control and controlling what you can, but the place where it goes wrong is usually those problems are too big for a single individual to resolve, right? So they induce chaos by trying to claim everything is within their control because they're ineffectively articulating the boundary of what they individually can control and where they need help, right? And so like another one of my kind of patented answer non-answers there, Ed. And I think that's something that we really need to be careful with, right? When you have an escalation, when things hit the fan, right? As the leader of that room, as the person running that escalation, your job, like your domain of control, is to set the standard and to set the tone and to delegate. It's not to actively go and do the things because 9 times out of 10, there aren't enough hours in the day for you as an individual to just like go and steamroll and do all of the things, right? You have to leverage your team. You have to utilize your team. So your locus of control becomes how do you impact the game from behind the bench, not from being on the playing field.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've seen what you're describing. I've also seen the kind of giving up almost where it's like, well, everything's out of my control and just complaining about it without trying to find areas that you could influence it or find the areas that you could have some control over, or even just having control over yourself to not blame up or down the org or sideways, or, sometimes people blame their team or whatever. So I think that's something that I see. And then sometimes I've definitely seen just the emotionless, like I wouldn't call it a shutdown per se because they might still be taking action or trying to move things forward, but it's like not acknowledging the difficulty of the situation or the impact that it's having on other people. I think we see that sometimes with layoffs where it's like, well, this was a really hard business decision, and they basically try to ignore the human side of it and the human feelings and emotions on it. And I think, some of these points are the failure point that Stoicism should be addressing, since the philosophy of Stoicism doesn't say don't feel the feelings, don't feel the pressure, or don't feel the fact that this hurts people or sucks for you or whatever. Stoicism says feel it, name it, and then ask what it's telling you. Pretty similar to some of the stuff we talked about when we were talking about mental fitness and things like that. And I think a lot of people lose that about Stoicism, is they think Stoicism means anti-emotion, but it's not. Emotions are signals. If you have a strong feeling of anxiety about a decision, that's useful information for you. It could be pointing to something, like maybe there is something that's genuinely outside of your control and you need to figure out how to just let it go. But it might be pointing out something that you're avoiding, or that you're missing, where you actually have power to address it. So that was kind of the distinction I wanted to make sure we were really clear about with Stoicism. Is it's not about, I think a lot of people think it's about controlling your emotions, but it's not about controlling your emotions. Because as soon as you say like Stoicism is about controlling your emotions, that you're basically framing it in a way that implies you have to have a permanent grip on your emotions at all time. But it's about owning your mindset, recognizing where you are, what drives that feeling, and then deciding how you're going to respond, and having enough awareness to make a stoic move, which is I'm going to respond in this way because I'm choosing to, not because my emotions are compelling me to respond in a particular way.
Yeah, and a lot of it, right? It's about being able to be deliberate and thoughtful in those responses, right? Being able to take the time you need to respond effectively. I'm really glad you brought this up, right? Because it's like it's such a common misnomer that like the Stoic is one without emotions. When like the reality is that that's wholly untrue, right? The Stoics go through a whole bunch of different practices to, you know, bring themselves back down to earth, right? So, like Marcus Aurelius talks at great length about avoiding being dyed purple, right? So the emperor's cloak was purple, right, and it was the only purple cloak in all of Rome at the time, and he didn't want that to impact him, right? He wanted to remain as himself, right, as Marcus Aurelius, and not let the power or the weight of what he is responsible for cloud who he is, or cloud his judgment. In his writings and meditations, which by the way is has nothing to do with meditation. It's functionally his journal.
It's his
Interesting.
meditations. It's his
It's his
reflection.
meditations, right? And he's very clearly writing to himself, right? A lot of what he writes about is like the stuff he's dealing with, right? I think one of the opening chapters, talks about how the people you will deal with today will be cantankerous and you know um, rife with subterfuge, and it's basically talking about like the body politic in Rome, and how much of a swamp it is. And his thing is like, and that's good. That is how they are, and you should let them be who they are. This is why you studied philosophy, right? Like this is why you've taught yourself these things to like rise above the fray there. He also, like, to kind of harp on the like lack of like the anti-unfeeling, like he talks about how beautiful bread breaking is, or like the waves of grain. Like he really talks in his book a lot about like just how beautiful all of these little moments are, like these kind of like little sublime aspects of being alive, which to me is like, that's not somebody who's burying their emotions. That's somebody who's like wildly in touch with their emotions, who can look at the way that the like weight of the dew lands on the grain, and how beautiful of a phenomenon that is. Like that's the opposite of this. So don't get stuck in that trap that like this is about bottling up your emotions. This is about being in control of how you respond to things, and how you go about the actions that you follow through, and treating those as signals, not as a control, right? A stoic is not going to get angry, but I can tell you they're definitely not going to like throw a chair through a window.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
It's use those emotions effectively, not recklessly.
Yeah. Well, so I think this leads us to an obvious question, which is like, how did we get so far from this original concept, this philosophy that's existed for thousands of years, into this Broicism trap that we're kind of stuck into today? Where did this distortion happen, and where did it come from? And I couldn't really figure out as I was trying to do some research. I don't know that I could point to any one source where I found that this started to be used this way, but I was able to find some info that traced the word stoic in popular English as meaning emotionless since at least the Victorian
Mhm.
era. So probably sometime around then. It could have been even sooner. It seems like that there was already a this idea of the British stiff upper lip and like don't show pain, don't show weakness, carry on, and somewhere in that mix it got labeled as stoic and the label stuck. But none of that is really the philosophy, right? That's just like a cultural defense mechanism that they've
Mhm.
labeled with something that had a positive connotation. And I think, I think that word, a lot of people hear it, and there's, even if you don't know what it means, it's almost like you want it to mean something positive, or it has like power behind it or something.
Yeah, there's probably also a connection, at least in North America, to like, the greatest generation, right? Like functionally our grandparents, coming back from World War II, not talking about that kind of like the Clint Eastwood archetype, especially in his, the movies in the last like 10 or 15 years of like the quiet, solid, seemingly unfeeling, veteran type. I'm sure that brought it. And then I think in like the last 10 or 15 years, right, as like hustle culture has really taken hold, this like grind some more has co-opted a lot of the principles or approaches to some extent for use, right? Like a lot of this, like a lot of these things, it's good advice explained poorly or like not fully explained. Um and i think that's really driven like what we now kind of refer to as broicism, right? This sort of like unfeeling, unthinking, grind sort of approach, which is not only untrue to the core source material, um but is like a really poor way to go about things for an extended period of time, right? It's one of those things that's like this can work for a finite amount of time, and if that's how you go through things, like that's okay. I'm not saying don't do that, but it's incomplete for long-term flourishing and long-term community building or like just yeah, flourishing, right? Having a life worth living, and being the kind of leader that people truly want to respect and work for.
Yeah. I mean, I would say in a lot of cases, it's actively harmful for people.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, Broicism is, like you're saying, it's basically that Victorian stiff upper lip, don't show pain or weakness combined with hustle culture. Like when you blend those two things together, you get this distorted idea. I don't even want to call it a philosophy because I don't think it really is, but
Yeah.
this idea, and it's all the markers that I think you kind of mentioned. I'll hit off the ones I had. It was never show doubt. Emotion is weakness. Failure means you didn't grind hard enough. Discomfort is just a mindset problem. I like those are some of the common things, and I think social media has accelerated it a lot because there is something about the aesthetic of being an unflinching leader who like, oh, I can just operate above normal human emotion and normal human feeling. And I think that a lot of people probably, for whatever reason, aspire to be that. And maybe it's maybe it's I think a lot of it probably is missing the truth behind it, which is like emotions are useful, and if you know how to leverage your emotions or notice how you feel and things like that, they can, like, that's really where the strength is. um, and that can look the same on its face, or in a, if you don't go deeper into what's behind it, that can look very similar to that unflinching leader. But the I think the difference is how much humanity is actually behind it and how much
Mhm.
understanding is behind it.
Yeah, and as we're kind of doing this like high level survey on stoicism here, right? I think it's important to kind of unpack a couple other pieces there too, right? So yeah, as I said before, right, this is like the core philosophy is a philosophy of citizenry and a philosophy of leadership, right? It fully acknowledges the imperfection of the world that we live in, right, and encourages its practitioners to also acknowledge that, right, and then define their locus of control and operate within it. Um, the Stoics themselves, with almost no exceptions, were incredibly politically active and community active, right? The core, founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution was ripe with Stoics, right? A lot of change agents have studied Stoic philosophy. The Romans, who were where kind of started in the initial Stoa, right, the painted porch, um, were wildly active. They were senators, they were Congress people, they
Yeah.
were business owners, they were the emperor of Rome at the time, and broadly speaking, these are the people, we often take for granted that like the arc of time bends towards justice. And we forget that there are individuals who are literally out there bending, like creating that arc, right? Moving things towards justice. And in a lot of instances, those were the Stoics, right? And we can talk at great length about all of the inequities of ancient Rome, and all of those inequities are true and should not be swept under the rug. But these were the people who were working to reduce those inequities over time. And I'll said it twice now. I'll say it a third time, right? Stoicism is not intended to make you a better psychopath. It's been intended to make you a better citizen, and that's really where we should be thinking about things, and that's where the virtues are really driven.
Yeah, and I know we'll talk about the virtues in a minute. I guess just to put the bow on this kind of broicism or dollar sign stoicism.
I
Um,
love that dollar signs.
yeah, if you replace the S with a dollar sign, that's kind of what it looks like to me. But what you just described is when stoicism is applied well, you get these great business leaders and politicians and all of this stuff. But what broicism, or this sort of manipulated view of stoicism, turns into a lot of times is leaders who confuse emotional distance for being steady, leaders who equate suppression with strength, leaders who are underneath, often the most reactive people in the room, but try to they just try to stay with a stone face basically, but really they're thin skinned and their reactions are going to be extremely high or strong, or you might not, you might be walking on eggshells around them, or you may not want to cross their paths because of their reactions. And all the research on emotional suppression and leadership is pretty consistent. Leaders who bottle their emotions rather than process tend to make worse decisions under pressure and generate more anxiety in the people around them, not less. So when you really think about that, like any leader who's out there saying, "Oh, I'm a stoic," or "I'm going to be a stoic, and the way I'm going to do that is suppressing all of my emotions," you're doing a disservice for your company, for the people that work for you, but a disservice for yourself as well, where you're going to make worse decisions, you're going to have more anxiety and create more anxiety, and you're not going to get what you're looking for from anyone around you because you're not putting yourself into a position where they're able to or free to communicate with you in a way that'll lead to everyone being more successful. So, I mean, Andy, have you seen that up close? Someone who was maybe praised for being stoic or held up as a model of control, but when you actually get closer to the team or the people around them, you realize they're walking on eggshells or burning out.
Yeah, and it's super common, or that individual is burning out, right? Because they're trying to carry the load themselves, and like you could do that for a period of time, but you can't carry that entire load yourself for forever. Yeah, I think that that's pretty common. As somebody who for years now has been very interested in like the literal philosophy of lowercase stoicism, um, I almost find it bothersome when I hear somebody described as a stoic, because to me it's analogous to like attributing, saying like, oh, Ed is such a insert whatever religious domination denomination or something like, right, because it's like, oh, so you're saying he's a philosopher, right? Like, it's like my brain is, is just entirely wired on that side of thing, like, where I'm like, oh no, I don't think you're using that word the way it's intended to be to be used. I don't think that means what you think it means. What you're saying is different, and it's not a nice thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so, just to put a pin in all of this, real stoicism creates steadiness that people can rely on, but broicism creates unpredictability that other people have to manage. There was one particular failure mode that I wanted to specifically call out with broicism, which is that at least some of the videos that get promoted to me on YouTube and stuff that are not about the philosophy and are this fake hustle culture, stoicism, broicism stuff, is that there's everything I've ever seen in that space, or the people who promote it, has no healthy way to process failure, right? A genuine stoic or a genuine stoicism gives you a clear path. You look at the failure and you say, well, what was in my control and what wasn't? And then own what was in your control honestly. If you didn't get a job, maybe you didn't do a good job on the resume, or you didn't prepare for the interview well, or what are the things that were inside of my control. And then you release the rest without beating yourself up about it, right? Like, maybe you just weren't quite as qualified as somebody else might have been. Maybe you knew it was a stretch to apply for that job. So,
Mhm.
um, but in broicism, there's no basis or mechanism for that. If you fail, it's because you didn't hustle hard enough, or you didn't try hard enough, or grind hard enough, or you weren't tough enough, or there's something wrong with you. And that is not philosophy. I would say, to use a Brene Brown language, I would say that that's just a shame spiral, that somebody is taking like Roman aesthetic because they like the helmets or something, I
Mhm.
don't know, and trying to bundle them together. And we were
Yeah.
talking about Marcus Aurelius a lot, and I will mention, like, everybody, if you go read more about Stoicism, you'll probably find that you have a favorite Stoic philosopher. There's a bunch of them that all have sort of different viewpoints or focuses or angles, and different ones resonate with different people. But like Marcus Aurelius, the what I just described of beating yourself up or saying there's something wrong with you, that's the opposite of what Marcus Aurelius did. He kept this private journal that was filled with self-examination, self-doubt, and lots of reminders to be patient and humble. And
Mhm.
so, like, that should be that's the historical record of Stoicism. That should be our historical reference point, and how we understand it. Not this alpha posture or unfeeling conqueror, but like someone who recognizes that they're in a position of power and that things might be difficult because of that, and knows that like Marcus Aurelius knew that being in that position, like you said with the purple robes, like, could cause him to lose what made him human, or what made him relate to the common person. And he did everything he could, particularly in this journal that we have this record of, which is pretty amazing, to not fall into that trap.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the things too, right? Like, kind of coming back to some, like, the leadership principles or some of the actions, right? So the Stoics were very action driven, right? These are not navel gazing philosophers. These are people who are out in the world literally practicing. And I think it was Marcus Aurelius, when the Roman Empire was having some money trouble. He literally had like a yard sale. Like, he started selling his own possessions to continue to like, pay for the operation of the kingdom. Right, rather than raising taxes, which he had the mandate to do, rather than doing anything like that, he said, no, like, I'll just sell the nice things that we have here to do that, right? I think it was Seneca used to periodically take a week to wear his roughest clothes and eat nothing but rice and beans, as a reminder that he could do that, and that everything he had beyond that was a luxury, and that he shouldn't get used to that, which is pretty simple, similar to, like, Marcus Aurelius trying to avoid being quote unquote dyed purple. They've got a lot of things, where, like, the Stoics will very frequently describe things in their most basic form, right? So, an easy one to think about is like, well, wine is just rotten grape juice. It's all it is, right? And they do a lot of these things to bring themselves back down to earth, and to like not to remain humble, right? To remain kind of in control. And I think that a lot of those practices are useful for us to think about as well, right? Like what in your life is necessary versus what's unnecessary, or what's a luxury that you've just kind of been accustomed to. And I think it is, I think that's part of why people like camping, right? Is it's a good reminder of just how comfortable central air and a kitchen really are, right? So just a few things, yeah, worth remembering and thinking about.
Yeah, and as you were saying that story, it reminded me of a just because there's so many parallels in so many of these philosophies. But there was, I don't know if this is Buddhist or Zen, or it might be from both. There's a parable about a monk who has this beautiful, delicate, prized teacup. And one of his students asks him about it because, he's like, hey, you're not supposed to be attached to anything, but you have this cup and you drink from it every day and you take good care of it. And the monk said, well, the cup is already broken. And so in his mind, in his perception, he's already
Mhm.
accepted that this thing that he maybe loves, maybe appreciates deeply, is already destroyed. And so that's his way like of kind of both, where he appreciates the
Yeah,
thing as he has it, but also is not tying he has impermanence with it, and acknowledges that it will one day be gone.
yeah.
I think that's a great
There's a
example.
similar story for I think it's Seneca, where he has a beautiful lamp in the entranceway to his home, and a thief breaks in and steals his lamp, and his response to that is, maybe I should have a less expensive lamp in front of my house,
Yeah.
right? So he just kind of like lets it go. So like rather than like pursue this guy, or like press charges, he's like, well, that's what happens when you put something real nice at the front of your
Yeah.
house. I should have
What was it?
something
It was like
less
a
nice there.
brass lamp, I think, and it gets stolen, and
Yeah,
he replaces it with like a ceramic, like a pottery style lamp instead, because that's going to be less valuable and less appealing
yeah,
for a thief.
precisely.
We had a little technical glitch and had to stop recording in the middle of this one, so we're back finishing it a few days later. As a Stoic would say, the obstacle is the way. Honestly, the delay gave me a little extra time to make the rest of this episode hopefully even better. So earlier we walked through the dichotomy of control, sorting what's in your hands from what isn't. Then we talked about Broicism and how it has no healthy way to process failure. But both of those really only scratch the surface of Stoicism, because at its core, Stoicism isn't about control. It's about pursuing one thing above everything else, and that thing is virtue. So let's talk about what virtue actually is and why the Stoics cared so much about it, and then what the cardinal four virtues are for Stoicism. So the question I wanted to answer here is, when the Stoics said virtue, what did they actually mean, and why did they make it kind of the whole point of Stoicism? And I think for a lot of people today, virtue is going to sound prudish, like you're a goody two shoes or a moral superiority or something like that. But that's not what the Stoics meant at all. For them, the idea of virtue, the word they used was arete, which for them meant excellence. They would say the virtue of a knife is its sharpness. The thing a knife is for, which is cutting, done well. So the sharper a knife is, the better it can do its job. So they would say the virtue of a human being is to reason and act with excellence of character, basically meaning whatever's in front of you with clear judgment and good action. So you're not yanked around by impulse or ego or just responding to things based on emotion. And their goal was eudaimonia. And I think there's people to pronounce it in different ways. That's how I've heard it, though. And a lot of people will translate eudaimonia as happiness, but it wasn't just happiness. The Stoics meant it as flourishing. So it's living a genuinely good, excellent life. It's being the best at whatever you're actually equipped for right where you are. So if your job today is washing dishes, flourishing would be washing those dishes with total excellence. So it's not really the size of the role, but it's the excellence that you bring to it, is what they meant by eudaimonia. And all of this connected to this concept they called summum bonum, which is the highest good. And they would say that virtue is the one thing that is good in and of itself. It's the only thing you need to live well. You could have money, status, comfort, but all of those things are just material. that you either use well because you are using virtue and you're trying to live in a virtuous way, or you're not using them well because of the lack of virtue. There's no actual um, uh, like money by itself is not good or bad. It's how it's used when it's connected to the concept of virtue. And they also would look at these virtues that we're going to break down in a second as an interlocking system. It's not like a where you pick and choose what you want. They're a package deal. It's really one skill that they're looking at from four different viewpoints. We'll break these down in just a second, but it's kind of this idea of like, well, courage without justice is maybe just bullying, and temperance without wisdom is maybe just pointless self-denial. You can't really have one of these without the others. So before we get into the virtues, anything you'd want to add, Andy, about your understanding of the eudaimonia or arete and some of the other concepts of virtue that the Stoics held?
No, I think that's a really good summary that there, Ed. I think that you've really just hit the nail on the head.
Awesome. Well, let's break down the four virtues, and we're going to talk about these in a particular order. Andy and I have seen these in a lot of different orders, but this was kind of the order that felt like it made the most sense and built upon each other based on what I've read and my understanding of these. So the first one is wisdom, or the ancient Greek word the Stoics would have called it phronesis, and this is really the foundation. And I think that wisdom is a lot of what we've talked about already. Like the flow chart we talked about at the beginning of this episode is really kind of distilling this idea of wisdom into something. Now, a lot of
I
us,
think you could even think of it as discernment, right? If we're
yeah,
looking for other words to kind of you know dial things down, right? The English language is not always precise. The translations from Greek are not always the best. So I think it's helpful to describe these in a couple of different ways to help folks, kind of grasp really what it is we're talking about.
yeah. So when you hear wisdom, you might think of, I think a lot of people would think of wisdom as getting old and just like gaining wisdom as you get older. Maybe some people would say it's like memorizing trivia or knowing the answers to lots of stuff. And some people probably think of wisdom as like a guru sitting on a mountaintop giving cryptic advice that you have to, you can only understand if you've done some practice or something like that. But the Stoics didn't mean any of those things when they talked about wisdom. They were really meaning practical wisdom. So, this idea of like knowing what's good and what's bad and what's neither, and then acting on the difference between those things. So, the example that one example that came to mind for me would be you get an email that you read and it feels kind of hostile. Wisdom would be taking a moment, taking a pause where you separate the fact an email arrived from the judgment, like, oh, this guy's out to get me, or this is an attack or whatever, before you immediately fire back with a nasty email of your own. So wisdom would be taking that moment to like process what's going on and not just jump into action immediately. What else do you think of when you think of wisdom from the Stoic sense, or how would you explain it to people?
Yeah, I think it's knowing what to do or what to focus on or where to focus your attention, right? It's I think less about like knowing what a solution is, but knowing more about knowing how to get to the right solution. And one of the things I want to also kind of harp on here, Ed, is like with all of the virtues, but especially with wisdom, right? This is a lifelong pursuit, right? You know, as you kind of alluded to, right, with the idea of like the sage or the old person who is wise, right? We think of wisdom as this thing that eventually we arrive at. But the reality is that the pursuit is to be more wise today than you were yesterday, right?
Hmm.
And that comes from everything, from like folk wisdom of, don't walk in places where you can't see your feet to like, real kind of depth of understanding from life experience, right? So I just want to make sure that folks who are listening, right, this is a constant pursuit. It's a deliberately unattainable goal, right? There's no point where you reach the finish line of now you are wise. The pursuit is be more wise today than you were yesterday, or at the very least less unwise, if that helps you think about it a little bit better.
Yeah. And to put a leadership lens on it, I would say, the Stoics, I think, believe that this was the foundation of everything else. Like if you're not making wise decisions or using your wisdom, then you're just kind of making decisions randomly or in a vacuum or for your own gain. And when we think about wisdom as being a pause between stimulus and response, kind of at its most core, most fundamental, uh, it really means that it's where a leader is choosing reason instead of just reacting. So if you can build that pause or build that space between something happening and you responding so that you have time to think about it and process it and categorize it, like, is this actually bad or is it just a thing that has happened that I need to accept? Maybe you could even ask, where is the good in this, or what's the opportunity that we might be able to take from a potentially bad situation? Those are some of the things that I think demonstrate wisdom, um, more than what we think of as just like having lots of experience and therefore knowing the right thing to do in all situations. It's a lot more about, like Andy was saying, responding to, figuring out what to do in all situations and knowing you have steps that you can do it, as opposed to knowing you have the answer right away. So that
Agreed.
leads us to temperance. And temperance in ancient Greek, the Stoics would have, the word was sophrosony. Sophrosony. Took me a minute. I was trying to break them down
Greek is
earlier.
very hard.
Yeah, it is.
Let's extend
Sophrosony.
some grace here.
And temperance, you can think about it as wisdom that is held. So the to connect it back to wisdom we were just talking about, if you practice wisdom but without temperance, then it's just good ideas that you maybe never actually execute on. So when you hear the word temperance, I think a lot of people might think of like the temperance movement from U.S. history, and like, no alcohol or strict diets and no fun or white knuckling your whole personality. But what the Stoics really meant by temperance was, um, almost like self mastery and self
Mhm.
moderation, and knowing what's enough and when it's enough. So I think an example of temperance would be, you're working, it's a long day, and maybe you have more work to do, but logging off at 6 p.m. anyway, because you know that you want to spend time with your family and they need you, instead of spending a few more hours like chasing inbox zero or following up on emails because you think that it'll help you accomplish something. Like it's that knowing where you need to stop or where you do need to hold back, so that you're not running at 100% all the time. How does that resonate with you, or what do you think about when you think of temperance from the Stoic perspective?
Yeah, I often equate temperance with discipline, right? To use slightly more modern vernacular, and I think again, there, Ed, you really hit it right, because oftentimes, especially if you use discipline in place of temperance, right? We think of like grind set mindset, or some of these anti patterns that are not constructive. And for anyone here who's got any sort of practice, right? So yeah, I know we've spoken about this. Like I run a lot. I've been running a lot for long enough now that I can't remember not doing it, right? So it's actually easier for me to go for a run in the morning than it is for me to not go for a run in the morning. But when you're working through an injury, right, that temperance, that discipline to know, actually, I need to not do this thing today so that I can do it in the future, is part of that application, right? It's knowing what to do, it's knowing what your boundaries are, right? It's it's not having a drink, it's maybe not having the second one or the third one, or kind of whatever that tipping point. It's maintaining that degree of self mastery and self control, but it's not like, it shouldn't be in the pursuit of some sort of unattainable perfection, or some sort of like monastic, unfun sort of life, right? It's that, everything in moderation, including moderation, sort of approach is the way that I think the Stoics would look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that's, something about the Stoics is there are some trains of philosophy that would say you need to give up all material possessions, or those types of things. And the Stoics acknowledge that, like, it's totally natural to have preferences for things and want things to be certain ways, but it doesn't mean that it should be your whole identity or tied around it. And I think temperance kind of helps with that as well, where it's like, um, we talked about the cup story
Mhm.
when we were recording the first half of this, but I think part of that kind of ties in with that as well, where it's like, well, yes, I can prefer foods that are more delicious or richer from a really great chef, but I also know that those might not be available to me all the time, and sometimes I just need to have like a really basic meal because food is also fuel, and sometimes you don't need the most delicious, most wonderful food. You just need something that'll give you sustenance. And so I think kind of thinking about things in that way can be a different way to think about temperance as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's good to remember here, right, that the the Stoics that we read these days, who are most often quoted or referenced, or who a lot of these ideas come down from, had wildly different lives, right? We talked about Epictetus, who was a slave, right? We talked about Marcus Aurelius, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire, right? Seneca was the right hand man to the emperor. He was extremely wealthy
He was
during his
essentially a
day.
billionaire.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Essentially, right. During his time, right. And I think that they would say things like Seneca would say, like, yes, obviously, it is preferable to be wealthy, but it's not defining, right. He would, to prove to himself that he, like, this was not who he was. It was a circumstance that he was living in. He would wear his worst clothes and eat rice and beans for like a month and like sleep on mats and whatnot to show that this wasn't a necessity. So I think, don't don't let these things kind of allow you to get out of touch with the core of the philosophy, right? Which is abundantly practical and applicable to all of you know all walks of life functionally. So
Yeah. So this takes us to the third virtue, which is courage or Andrea. And this would be really wisdom under pressure. So we talked about temperance. If you have temperance without courage, you might be disciplined, but maybe you're weak the moment that something or someone pushes back on you. So when we think of courage, I think the most common thought that probably comes to most people's mind with this word is bravado or fearlessness, maybe being the loudest guy in the room, or being a warrior and going to battle, that sort of a thing. But that's not really what the Stoics meant. The Stoics, in this case, they think of courage as acting despite fear. Epictetus framed it as the power to persist and resist. So I think an example of courage, and this would be taking a page out of Brene Brown's book, would be admitting a real mistake to your team instead of burying it, right? Like Brene Brown would say, vulnerability is courage, and courage takes vulnerability. And I think that that's a lot of what the Stoics really meant behind this is like, if you have your wisdom and your temperance, and you believe in something, and someone pushes back on you, you need to stand up for what you think is right in those moments. And it's with wisdom and it's with temperance, and we'll talk about justice in a minute, which is really what ties all of these together. But you need to be able to stand up for what's right even when people push back on you, is I think a big part of what they would mean when they talk about courage. What comes to mind for you with courage?
yeah, I think a lot of it should be, kind of coming from that, like, social point of view, right? So courage needs to be in pursuit of something just and something wise, right? It's not doing something for something scary for the sake of doing something scary, right? It's not bravery for the sense of bravery. As the Stoics would see it, right? All of these virtues are intertwined, right? And courage is kind of the part of this virtue series that drives action, but that in order for something to truly be courageous, or at least in their view, it's got to be wise, it's got to be just, it's got to be in line with temperance, right? So like, they would, you know when we look throughout history, right, we see a lot of the Stoics doing extremely courageous things, to kind of bend the arc of history towards justice, right? The founding fathers of the United States were quite a few of them were very well versed in Stoic philosophy, right? You can see a lot of Stoic philosophy in the founding documents. Admiral Stockdale in the Vietnam War, right? Not only like he was leaning on all of these virtues. In fact, when his plane crashed, he said, "I'm leaving the world." The world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. And during his time in a prisoner of war camp, he had multiple opportunities where he could have worked his way out, but that would have done irreparable harm to the overall mission as well as the fellow soldiers that he was there with, right? So he used his discipline, right, his courage, his wisdom, his sense of justice to advocate for the other folks who were there. His story is really incredible. I know we're not going to have time to dive into it, but for those of you following along at home, please go look up Admiral Stockdale. What a tremendous example of bravery and courage in like under just unimaginable duress. It's really, really cool what he was able to do. If you're familiar with John McCain's story about being a prisoner of war, there's a lot of similarities there, right? But that courageousness is definitely, it's got to be intertwined, right? It's yeah, these virtues all touch each other, right? And we it's very easy to silo them, and they were never intended that way.
Yeah. So courage, I would say the Stoic view on courage in leadership, especially, would be almost more like moral courage. So for leaders out there, it might be having that hard conversation or holding the line on something on principle, even if might be easier or better rewarded to fold. You need to stay you need to stay courageous and do what is right, even in the face of fear or risk to yourself. And all of that takes us to justice. Dikaiosoni is how they said it, I think. If you got a better pronunciation, let me know. It's always hard to find
I
multiple
wouldn't trust my
pronunciations.
Greek either, Ed.
But justice is really where all of this culminates, right? So we talked about courage. Well, if you have courage without justice, that might turn more into bullying, right? It's like standing up for something but not doing it for the right reasons. So really, justice is this is here because all the others are for justice, right? So when you hear justice, you might think of like lawsuits or lawyers or the justice system or punishing wrongdoers or getting even. But the Stoics, when they talk about justice, they really mean it as our duty to one another. Marcus Aurelius called it the most important virtue, and it's rooted in this concept they had, sympatia, that we're all deeply interconnected. As Marcus Aurelius put it, what injures the hive injures the bee. So this is the kind of thing where we talked about you see someone like getting bullied or whatever, and you need to have the courage to stand up for it. But part of that, what's behind that, is that you are standing up for people and for your community and for things that you know are right, even in the face of even if all of society is telling you that it's wrong, basically. Um, so this could be as a leadership, maybe this might be like taking the blame when the team fails. I know we've talked about this in the past with leadership language, like we language or I language, especially when you're taking ownership of a failure, and then not using I language for the wins and using we language or putting those wins on the team. I think that's a great example of justice at the leadership side. But it could be even just like standing up for the underdog or standing up for somebody who's not getting the societal recognition that they deserve or is being stomped on. If you like Andy had talked about previously, Marcus Aurelius, they needed to raise money. He could have raised taxes on everyone, but from his perspective, that wouldn't be justice, right? Justice is that he, as the leader and the wealthy one, that he would sell his possessions to try to make up that delta, and he would wait as long as possible before putting that burden onto the people. So I think that's some good examples of justice. What do you think about the Stoic justice, and what resonates with you around it?
Yeah, I love the idea of, what harms the bee harms the hive here, right? And I think that that's a really good way to think about things. And not to get onto a soapbox or an extended rant, right? But I think we're at a position in society where we're increasingly forgetting about that aspect, right? That we are all interconnected, and the opposite of what harms the bee harms the hive, right? Is the what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Or a rising tide raises all ships. I think that it's really critical to try to think through things in those lenses, right? And try to think through kind of the end state of things. And I want to be clear here, right? Like, the Stoics were not perfect, at least not they aren't now the active ones today, nor were the ones who at the forefront of the philosophy, right? Ancient Rome was not a particularly pleasant place to be, especially if you were not the emperor, right? We talked already explicitly about Epictetus being a slave. We don't need to go further down that road. So they clearly had blind spots in their view of justice. But just as we talked about with wisdom and temperance and courage, right? Justice is an evolving thing. Justice is reliant on wisdom, and it should continue to expand, right? One of the we talked a little bit about the locus of control. One of the things that I think is also important to think about is, like, your goal as a human, right, or as somebody who studies philosophy or is following stoicism. It should be to expand your circle of care. And what I mean by that is, like, it's very easy to think, okay, I care about my partner and my dog, and I don't care. Well, you should care about your partner and your dog and your kids and your family and your extended family and your neighbors and your neighbors' neighbors. And you should be trying to make that circle of who you can care about as large as you possibly can, right? One of the things that I've said for ages now, as you gain more in your life, right, you should not be looking to build a taller fence. You should be looking to build a bigger table.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I mean, I think really justice is behind a lot of what we talk about in this podcast and a lot of our episodes. The Stoics would say justice is active responsibility to the people around you. And that's really the exact opposite of kind of the negative Broicism that we've talked about previously. That's very self-serving and inwardly focused, and Stoicism is really very outwardly focused, and like how can what I do help those people around me? Um,
Yeah. And I also want to make sure that, we remind folks that, like, you also need to be acutely aware that justice, like all things, depends on incremental progress, right? It can be very easy to force things into some sort of, purity test, or like this, this as this problem, or that problem, I can't do this, right? And then you end up, I'm trying to remember the name of the character from The Good Place, who tries to do everything perfect, and he just, like, can't have a life at all, right? Um, Everything kind of depends on incremental progress, right? So justice is doing the most good for the most people, given the situation at hand, right? There's always going to be compromises. There's always going to be things that you don't like. The idea of, like, complete or total justice for everyone, unfortunately, isn't realistic within the constructs of a complex, um, multicultural society like we all live in. The goal is to move the ball down the field, and to move the ball down the field in the right direction, and keep it from moving backwards.
yeah. No, and that's why wisdom is so important to tie into this, because uh, if all you do is pursue justice all of the time, but don't have wisdom or temperance, then you may wind up in a position where you're pushing harder than things can accept, or pushing against people who are going to push back really hard. Where if you
Mhm.
used your wisdom and temperance and then combined it with that courage and justice, you might be able to see incremental progress and incremental change that you might not be able to get if you push too hard, too fast, all at once.
Yeah, precisely. Precisely.
So, Andy, when you think about leaders you've worked with, and you hold up this sense of justice, the way we're talking about it, active responsibility to people around you, how do you think that mindset affects how people manage their teams day to day? Do you think that most leaders consciously live or maintain awareness of this sense of justice, or is it something that people pay lip service to, or maybe just ignore completely?
Um, I'm going to be the optimist, and I'm going to say that most leaders and most leaders we deal with, or the leaders that we're our listeners are going to be interacting with, are making an earnest attempt at this, right? One of the things that you realize, as you lead larger teams or work in different organizations, right, is that the decisions as you go higher and higher up the chain at any organization get harder and harder and harder to make, right? Um, Not going to drop names. We've seen some pretty egregious decision making, over the last decade or so from some very visible senior leaders. I think that's the exception, not the rule. I think the vast majority of folks that you're going to interact with in your workplace are trying to do the best they can under increasingly trying circumstances, and we should extend them that grace. And again, this is the vast majority, not everyone. I'm sure that some of you have pretty awful leaders that you work for. You should go not work for them anymore at your soonest opportunity. So I just want to want to make that clarification there. Ed. But yeah, I think most folks are trying to do the best they can within the confines and constructs of their situations.
Yeah, and I do think that m- most leaders who maintain some level of awareness about these concepts are trying their best, and it's not always easy, and they fail, and sometimes they make decisions that aren't popular or aren't the ones they wish they could make in other circumstances, but they have to make them anyway. And then I would say, I don't know if I'm going to be optimistic or pessimistic here, but I do think there's a lot of leaders who probably don't think about this at all. They think about their position and what it means for them, and how they may not consciously think they're going to throw somebody under the bus, but they do because it protects them instead of taking that justice path. So I've definitely seen both sides of the coin. I agree, though. I feel very fortunate that my career has mostly been with leaders and with companies and organizations and structures that people are concerned about those things.
Mhm.
But it is easy to have day-to-day work or life stress or financial stress, economic stress. Any of those things could become very prominent and then make it hard to embody that sense of justice, even if you truly believe in it. And that's, I think, where we
Yeah.
have to, practice it and maintain these thoughts in our mind. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also worth kind of touching on a little bit here, Ed, that like obviously we're talking about Stoicism, right, which is a philosophy that dates back thousands of years. But these cardinal virtues are pretty ubiquitous, right? So like the Catholic cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Um, Functionally the same thing, right? And we see in most Western thought, the virtues remain the same. If you really look at a lot of Stoicism and the core of it, you'll notice that a lot of what it's talking about is unbelievably similar to all of the Eastern philosophies as well. So I just want to kind of call that out, that like this is not a unique thing to this specific philosophy. This is just a very practical application of uh, the same generalized thoughts that almost every culture that I'm aware of has either come to directly or come close enough for jazz, right? So these are not unique to explicitly Romans or Roman descendants or like the Western world. Like these are pretty ubiquitous concepts globally, for kind of all of humanity. And you'd be hard pressed to find any philosophy that deviates from this in a like substantially meaningful way, at least as far as like where they're going to point you, as far as like what a good life is going to look like.
Yeah. Yeah, and I did want to make one more connection between these concepts to servant leadership. The Stoics believed a position of power was itself a reason for greater obligation, not greater license. Power meant
Mhm.
more responsibility to the community, not less. And I think that's really the intellectual backbone of servant leadership. The leader's job is to clear the path so that other people can do their best work, and the leader's job is to absorb friction so that the other people who they're leading don't have to absorb that friction, and also that leaders need to stay grounded so that they can help all the people they're leading to stay grounded as well. So I think
Yeah.
like a leader who is genuinely a stoic and is following stoic philosophy in a reason like a meaningful way would name hard emotions in the room, and they wouldn't do it because it's like, oh, I need to get this off my chest or whatever. They do it because clarity helps serve the group, and a genuinely
Mhm.
stoic leader is going to make decisions based on what the situation requires, not what's going to protect them and their ego most. um, a genuinely stoic leader is going to accept outcomes that they can't or couldn't control without trying to find someone to blame. I'm sure we both and many listeners have probably heard the like, oh, where's the throat to choke on this? I don't think a genuinely stoic leader
Mhm.
would ever pull that card. That like when you combine those things, wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, and they're all working together, then that's what you get, right? You get like a leader who is able to name the hard emotions, to be present with themselves in difficult times, to lead people even when things are difficult, and not blame people, and bring people together. So I think that's why we wanted to talk about Stoicism. Is we both have learned about it and read about it, and I think we both do our best to consider it and utilize it in our daily lives. And I know both Andy and myself have seen so many just like bastardizations of it, and turning it dirty and making it wrong, and we really just wanted to make sure we broke this down in a way that was understandable and could help people see that like clamming up and just like toughing through it and working harder and grind set is really not what stoicism is all about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also want to emphasize the practical application here too, right? Marcus Aurelius mentions, I think, a couple of times across meditations, like this is why you studied philosophy. And what he means when he's saying that is that like studying philosophy is to supposed to give you the framework for action, right? Or for reaction with it, like when the rubber hits the road, when things get tough, right? And I just kind of want to remind folks that like the Stoics were men and women of action. I know that we've been talking about what sound like a bunch of old dead white dudes. And that's mostly because they're the ones whose writings have survived. There were countless women who are also identified as Stoics, and who are teachers who are written about. They're just l- a lot of them are kind of lost to history, unfortunately, just as a result of what texts did and did not survive. Um, but these were folks who were out in the world. These were merchants. These were business people. These were Congress people, and they would say that like if you've developed these skills, right? If you've built your life around these cardinal virtues, you owe it to society to go and be a person of action, right? And go and try to make things better. And you owe it to your fellow citizens to get involved and get engaged.
Yeah, this has all been great. So let's talk about how we can practice and how our listeners can practice, and what behaviors can we use tomorrow even to help us be more aligned with this stoic mindset and stoic approach. And I actually have five for today. So the first one I would say is run the flow chart that we talked about at the beginning of the episode. When you feel anxious, stuck, reactive about something at work, whatever, a strong emotion, try to stop and sort it, right? Catch it first. We kind of talked about this in our mental fitness episode, so that might be a good one to go listen back to, but try to catch it so that you can stop and pause, and then take a moment to sort through what is going on. Maybe write it down even if you have to. And you can use that flow chart of, do I have a problem? Can I do anything about it? And then decide how you can categorize it. Can I control this? Do I have any control? Do I have influence that I could influence the outcome? Or do I just need to accept that this is out of my control and out of my influence, and it is going to be what it is? And then act directly on the things that are in your control, work to shape the things that are inside your influence, and then accept and genuinely accept, not just suppressing and pretending like it doesn't matter, but just accept what's outside of both control and influence. And this wouldn't be a one-time exercise. This is like a habit to practice and work on. And leaders who use this a lot can start to do it fast and well and often. So that'd be the first one. The second one is name the emotion before you respond. Next time you feel a strong emotion in a work situation or in a life situation, try to name it to yourself before you say or do anything. This kind of adds on to the first one with the flow chart. We're not trying to suppress the emotions. We just need to understand what signal it's sending. What is this feeling pointing at? Why am I feeling this way? Is this is what it's pointing at something that I can actually affect? And we kind of run that flow chart again, and now we can figure out, can we do something or not? But that gap between having the feeling and responding to the feeling or letting the feeling overtake you is where a lot of Stoic practice lives. It's small. It's a small thing that you can work on and do, but it can change everything depending on how reactive you are today. The third thing was check the virtue that you're neglecting. We talked about 4 core virtues. So take 60 seconds and ask, of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, which one am I most under investing in right now? I think a lot of leaders may find that the answer is justice, but that may not be the case for everyone. But in the case of justice, are you actively serving the people around you? Or are you just managing them? Are you absorbing friction for your team or creating it? The virtue audit, it can be uncomfortable, but that's kind of the point. We have to face the things that might be uncomfortable and accept where, maybe we're not living up to what we hope to be or how we hope to be living. Number 4 is audit your own model. Take some time to reflect and try to be honest with yourself about whether what you're demonstrating is Stoicism or Broicism. Are you steady in a way that makes people feel safe, or are you distant in a way that keeps people guessing? The distinction isn't about how much you talk about your feelings, it's whether the people around you are more capable and more grounded because of your presence or less. If you feel like if you think that you're behaving in a certain way, but you feel like you're not getting the results that you're looking for, or the way people are interacting with you isn't matching what you would expect, then that audit may be even more important than you think. And that can also be a little bit uncomfortable, but I think it's a really valuable step to take. And then number 5, because we talked so much about Marcus Aurelius, try an evening journal. A lot of the Stoics practiced daily self-reflection. Seneca reviewed his whole day every single night. And Marcus Aurelius, we have this whole book of reflections that he made in the evenings. So tonight, take 3 minutes with a notebook and ask yourself, what did I do poorly today? What did I do well? What duty did I neglect? And don't beat yourself up about it. It's just a personal audit, so you can check in and see where you need to invest, or maybe you're over-investing somewhere that you need to back off a little bit using some of your temperance. So, Andy, how do those 5 resonate with you? Is there any that stands out as really powerful? Do you think any is really hard? And is there anything else you'd want to add?
Yeah, I think you summed it up nicely, Ed. As far as what's hard, I've continuously failed to start any sort of journaling practice. I don't know why I find it so super hard, but it's just a perennial challenge. Maybe that's just a combination of like life circumstances and motivation. As far as criticality or where I think folks should focus, I think the first one is really where it comes down to, right? Figuring out what's in your control and what's not in your control. And then focusing focusing on what you define as your locus of control, right? So, everything that happens, there's this gap in between what happens and your reaction to what happens, and that gap is where you have the most control. And I would really encourage folks to focus on that, focus on reflecting, right? Naming an emotion when you feel it, I think, is super powerful. But even just simply adding a pause before you do something, right? Give yourself time to fully process before you react, and not relying exclusively on it, is super helpful and really critical.
Awesome. That's where we're going to wrap up for today. Stoicism is not a stiff upper lip. It's not hustle culture. It's not emotional suppression dressed up as strength. The Broicism version, never feel, never doubt, failure is a character flaw, is not ancient wisdom. It's anxiety, insecurity, and weakness dressed up in a toga. Real Stoic philosophy asks something harder. It asks you to feel things clearly, sort what's in your power from what isn't, act with wisdom and courage, release without drama, and stay relentlessly accountable to the people who you are supposed to be serving. All four virtues work together, and none of them are optional. So here are your 2 challenges for this week. First is a practical one. Find one moment this week, one moment where you feel the pressure spike in your life, you feel stressed out, and run the flowchart. Even write it down if you have to. Control, influence, or accept. Then act accordingly. Don't skip the acceptance step. That's where a lot of people stall out and think that they're accepting without doing the full acceptance. And then second, the harder challenge is be honest about the kind of model you're being. Not whether you talk about emotions, but whether the people around you are steadier and more capable because of how you lead. Are you practicing justice, the actual Stoic virtue, the one that means active responsibility to your community, or have you maybe dropped that one? Stoicism has always been about leaving things better than you found them, and that starts with the people in the room with you. We'd love to hear from you on this one. Have you worked for someone who modeled genuine stoicism, steady and accountable and present? Or have you seen broicism passed off as strength and watched what it cost a team or an organization? Tell us about your experience. You can reach us at leadershipexplored@gmail.com or find us on LinkedIn. If this conversation was useful, please follow the show, leave a review, or share it with a colleague who's thinking about these questions. We release new episodes every other Tuesday. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.